What happens when the city that once defined fun, freedom, and possibility suddenly feels exhausting instead of exciting? New York was sold to the world as the ultimate playground, a place where nights never ended, opportunities waited on every corner, and energy itself felt contagious. For decades, having fun in New York wasn't something you planned. It simply happened. You walked outside, and the city carried you. Today, that feeling is gone, and almost no one wants to say it out loud. New York still looks the same in movies, social media, and marketing campaigns. Neon lights, rooftop bars, endless entertainment. But beneath that image, something fundamental has shifted. Fun used to be spontaneous. Now it feels scheduled, expensive, stressful, and monitored. The city that once invited people to relax now keeps them in a constant state of alert. Every outing comes with friction. Lines, rules, prices, surveillance, and exhaustion. Even joy feels regulated. This isn't about nostalgia or romanticizing the past. It's about a structural change in how the city functions. The simple act of enjoying yourself now requires planning, budgeting, mental preparation, and tolerance for frustration. What once felt alive now feels managed, controlled, optimized, and stripped of the chaos that made it human. People aren't saying New York is boring. They're saying it's heavy, emotionally and psychologically heavy. The question isn't why fewer people are having fun. The real question is why the city makes fun feel like work. Fun thrives on ease, safety, and freedom. New York now offers the opposite. Crowds without connection, noise without release, movement without momentum. You can be surrounded by millions and still feel isolated. You can spend hundreds of dollars in a night and go home drained instead of fulfilled. And here's the part no one wants to admit. This isn't accidental. It's the result of years of decisions that prioritized extraction over experience. Efficiency over enjoyment, control over culture. The city didn't lose its soul overnight. It was slowly reprogrammed, step by step, regulation by regulation, price hike by price hike, until fun became a luxury product instead of a shared urban experience. That's why something strange is happening. People aren't just leaving New York to save money. They're leaving to feel lighter, to breathe, to laugh without calculating the cost, to exist without feeling watched, rushed, or squeezed. The exodus isn't loud. It's quiet, subtle, but unmistakable. And the places people are choosing instead reveal a truth about New York that no billboard will ever show. Because when a city that once defined fun becomes a place people endure rather than enjoy, the problem isn't taste, it's structure. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. If this already feels uncomfortably familiar, that reaction matters. This isn't just a story about New York losing its fun. It's about recognizing how modern cities quietly reshape behavior, expectations, and even emotional limits without ever asking permission. Understanding this shift is the difference between thinking something is wrong with you and realizing something structural is wrong with the environment itself. If you've lived in a big city and felt drained instead of energized, pressured instead of inspired, this video isn't entertainment, it's context, and context changes how you see your own experience. That's why engaging here matters. Not for the algorithm alone, but because these patterns only stay invisible when people stay silent. Take a moment and leave a comment. Even something simple like, "I felt this," or "this explains a lot," helps surface conversations that cities themselves try to bury. If this perspective added clarity, hit the like button so more people who feel the same pressure can find it. And if you want deeper, honest breakdowns of what urban life is really doing to people beneath the surface, subscribing keeps you connected to what comes next. There was a time when the glamour of New York felt liberating. The crowds meant anonymity. The noise meant freedom. You could disappear into the city and feel more yourself, not less. Today, that same density feels inverted. Instead of anonymity, there is exposure. Instead of freedom, there is monitoring. The city didn't become less alive. It became more controlled. And that subtle shift changed everything about how fun feels here. Walking through New York now comes with an unspoken tension. Cameras on every corner, Signs telling you what not to do. Barriers, checkpoints, ticketed access, reservations, wristbands, scanners. Even spaces that once felt informal now feel procedural. Fun no longer unfolds naturally. It requires compliance. The glamour is still marketed, but the experience underneath is regulated to the bone. This constant oversight reshapes behavior in ways people rarely articulate. When you feel watched, you self-censor. When movement is constrained, spontaneity dies. When every action is priced, timed, or permitted, joy becomes conditional. You don't relax, you perform. You move through the city calculating risks, costs, and consequences. That mental load accumulates, slowly, invisibly, until fun feels exhausting rather than energizing. What makes this transformation so effective is that it's framed as safety, efficiency, and order. And on paper, those sound reasonable. But cities don't thrive on paper logic. They thrive on friction, surprise, and informal life. When those elements are squeezed out, what remains is a polished shell that looks vibrant but feels sterile. New York didn't lose excitement. It lost unpredictability. And unpredictability is where joy lives. The nightlife tells this story clearly. Nights that once stretched organically now end early. Venues that once welcomed anyone now filter aggressively. Entry lines, security checks, dress codes, time limits, dynamic pricing. You're not entering a social space. You're entering a managed environment designed to control flow, behavior, and spending. The result isn't excitement. It's anxiety masked as luxury. This surveillance isn't only technological, it's cultural. Social norms have tightened. Public tolerance has narrowed. Minor mistakes feel amplified. People are quicker to intervene, report, record. The city feels less forgiving, less playful. Fun requires a sense of safety not just from danger, but from judgment. When that disappears, people retreat inward. They stop exploring. They stop lingering. They go home earlier. Here's the quiet consequence. When fun requires constant vigilance, people don't rebel. They adapt. Then they leave. Not dramatically, not angrily, but pragmatically. They choose places where fun still feels light, where being out doesn't feel like navigating a system, where laughter doesn't echo against rules and cameras. This is how a city loses its joy without ever banning it, by making every moment feel monitored. And once glamour becomes surveillance, the question shifts from, what can we do tonight, to, why are we even here? At some point, New York crossed a line that few cities ever admit crossing. Living here stopped being a normal condition and became a qualification. Not officially, not written anywhere, but enforced quietly through prices, pressure, and fatigue. The city didn't announce that it was no longer meant for ordinary life. It simply made ordinary life impossible. Rent is the most obvious gatekeeper, but it's only the surface. Housing costs didn't just rise, they detached from reality. Apartments that once supported middle-class stability now demand salaries that assume constant upward mobility, zero interruption, and total commitment. Missing one step means falling behind, and falling behind in New York is unforgiving. The margin for error is gone. But the real shift goes deeper than rent. Everyday existence now carries a premium. Transportation, groceries, utilities, healthcare, entertainment, even basic convenience all extract more than they used to. Not occasionally, but relentlessly. Living becomes a series of microtransactions that never stop. Each one small enough to ignore. Together, overwhelming. The city doesn't drain you in one moment. It drains you slowly until you stop noticing how tired you are. This is where fun collapses. Fun requires surplus, not just money, but energy, time, emotional space. When all three are consumed by survival logistics, joy becomes optional, delayed, conditional. You don't go out because you're excited. You go out because you planned it weeks ago and feel guilty canceling. That's not leisure. That's obligation disguised as enjoyment. What's rarely discussed is how this environment reshapes identity. People don't just leave New York because it's expensive. They leave because they feel reduced to productivity, performance, and constant justification of their presence. You're no longer someone who lives here. You're someone who has to prove every month that you still deserve to. This pressure erodes community. When everyone is stretched thin, generosity disappears, spontaneity disappears, social life becomes transactional, networking replaces friendship, availability replaces presence. You don't ask, "How are you?" You ask, "What do you do?" Because in a city where living is a privilege, usefulness becomes the measure of belonging. And the most unsettling part is how normalized this has become. People defend it, rationalize it, wear it as a badge of honor. If it's hard, it must be worth it. If it's exhausting, it must mean success. That logic keeps people trapped long after the joy is gone. Until one day, they realize they are paying premium prices for a life that feels smaller, not bigger. This is how cities lose their residents without force. Not through eviction notices alone, but through a daily message that says, quietly and consistently, "This place is no longer built for you." And once living becomes a privilege, fun becomes irrelevant. Because you can't relax in a place that constantly asks you to earn your right to stay. New York didn't push people out with sirens or headlines. It didn't announce a purge or frame it as a crisis. The expulsion happened quietly, almost politely, through leases not renewed, neighborhoods rebranded, and prices adjusted just high enough to force a decision without ever naming it. That's what makes it so effective. No single moment feels dramatic, but the outcome is irreversible. Entire communities have been erased without demolition crews. The buildings are still there. The streets look clean. The cafes are full. Yet the people who gave those places meaning are gone. Artists, service workers, teachers, young families, immigrants. Not because they failed, but because the city recalibrated itself around a narrower definition of who belongs. Gentrification isn't just about wealth moving in. It's about life being pushed out. What makes this process hard to confront is how it's framed as improvement. New restaurants, new developments, new amenities. On the surface, it looks like progress. But progress for whom? When neighborhoods become financial instruments instead of living ecosystems, residents turn into liabilities. Their rent-controlled apartments are obstacles. Their long-term presence is inefficiency. The city doesn't tell them to leave. It simply makes staying irrational. This is why the expulsion feels invisible. People don't leave in protest. They leave exhausted. They leave quietly, telling themselves it's temporary, that they'll come back someday. They don't. Because once you step outside the pressure cooker, you realize how abnormal it was. How much energy it took just to remain in place. The cultural damage is profound. Cities thrive on continuity, on layered histories, on people knowing each other over time. When that continuity breaks, neighborhoods lose memory. Every block starts to feel interchangeable, safe, clean, expensive, and empty in spirit. The city gains polish and loses character. And character is what makes people want to stay, not just pass through. This expulsion also fractures trust. When residents watch friends disappear one by one, they stop investing emotionally. Why build relationships in a place designed to eject you? Why plant roots in soil that keeps shifting beneath your feet? Transience becomes the norm, even for those who technically stay. People live as if they're already leaving, detached, temporary, guarded. And here's the most unsettling truth. The city benefits in the short term. Higher rents, higher tax revenue, stronger branding, but it pays a long-term price. Without a stable population, social life thins out. Local culture flattens. The city becomes a stage set maintained for visitors, investors, and those passing through, not for people building lives. This is why fun disappears. Fun depends on familiarity, trust, and shared space. You can't have that when everyone feels replaceable, when belonging is conditional, when your presence feels provisional. New York didn't just price people out, it erased the conditions that made joy communal. And when a city quietly removes the people who once filled it with life, the emptiness that follows isn't visible at first, but it's felt everywhere. New York still sells itself as a marvel of modern urban life, but beneath the branding, the systems that make the city livable are quietly degrading. This isn't collapse in the cinematic sense. No single moment, no sudden blackout that forces everyone to look up. It's slower, more corrosive. A city running on aging bones while pretending it's evolving. Transportation is the clearest signal. Trains that feel permanently delayed, platforms that overflow, stations that smell of neglect rather than efficiency. What used to be minor inconveniences have become daily expectations. Commuting is no longer movement. It's endurance. People plan their lives around breakdowns instead of schedules. And when getting from one place to another drains you before the day even starts, the city takes more than time. It takes momentum. Housing infrastructure tells a similar story. Buildings marketed as luxury rely on systems barely holding together, elevators that fail, heating that breaks at the worst possible moment, repairs that take weeks, sometimes months. Meanwhile, older buildings decay, quietly, patched instead of renewed, because long-term maintenance doesn't fit short-term profit cycles. The city looks dense and vertical, but much of it is structurally tired. Public spaces reflect the same pattern. Parks are crowded but underfunded. Streets are constantly under construction, yet rarely improved. Scaffolding becomes permanent, not as a sign of renewal, but as an admission that nothing is ever fully fixed. The city feels like it's always being worked on and never finished. Progress becomes a performance rather than a result. What makes this especially damaging is the language used to justify it. Everything is framed as innovation, smart systems, digital solutions, optimization. But technology is often used to mask decline, not reverse it. Apps replace staff. Screens replace service. Automation replaces care. Efficiency becomes an excuse to remove the human layer that once absorbed friction and softened failure. This is where fun quietly disappears again. When basic infrastructure fails, every outing carries uncertainty. Will the train arrive? Will the power stay on? Will the venue even function as promised? Fun thrives on reliability, on the ability to relax into the moment. When the background systems are unstable, the foreground experience can never fully settle. People adapt, of course. They always do. They leave earlier. They lower expectations. They build buffers into their lives. But adaptation isn't resilience. It's accommodation. And accommodation drains joy. You're no longer exploring the city, you're navigating it, carefully, strategically, always anticipating the next disruption. This decay is easy to ignore because it doesn't affect everyone equally. Those with money can bypass it. Ride-hailing instead of trains. New buildings instead of old ones. Private solutions to public failures. But cities aren't meant to function as individual escape rooms. When shared systems weaken, shared life weakens with them. And that's the quiet contradiction of New York today. A city that looks advanced, talks modern, and markets progress while its foundational systems erode in plain sight. Not enough to force a reckoning, just enough to make daily life heavier, less forgiving, and less joyful. At some point, New York stopped reacting to disorder and started absorbing it. What once felt like temporary disruption is now treated as baseline reality. Delays, crowding, noise, breakdowns, confrontations, confusion. None of it shocks anyone anymore. That's the real shift. Chaos didn't intensify overnight. It normalized itself, quietly rewriting what people consider acceptable. When everything is slightly dysfunctional all the time, nothing triggers alarm. A train stalled between stations isn't a crisis. It's expected. A sidewalk blocked by construction for months isn't a failure. It's routine. A venue that cancels plans last minute or overbooks isn't unreliable. It's how things work now. This constant low-level instability erodes trust without ever making headlines. The human cost of this normalization is rarely acknowledged. Living in an environment where friction is constant forces people into a defensive posture. You leave earlier than necessary. You build contingency plans for basic activities. You brace yourself emotionally before stepping out. Over time, that vigilance becomes exhausting, not dramatic exhaustion, but a dull, persistent fatigue that drains enthusiasm. Fun doesn't survive in that climate. Fun requires surrender. It requires the feeling that things will probably work out. When chaos is the default, you never fully let go. Even in moments of leisure, part of your attention is scanning for problems. Where's the exit? How crowded is this getting? What's the backup plan? Joy becomes fragmented. What makes this especially corrosive is the social agreement to pretend everything is fine. Complaining feels pointless. Everyone's dealing with the same mess. So frustration turns inward. People blame themselves for being tired, irritable, or disengaged. They assume they're just not built for city life. In reality, the environment has quietly become hostile to ease. This normalization also changes behavior in public spaces. People rush. They avoid eye contact. They minimize interaction. Not because they're rude, but because interaction carries risk. Risk of delay, risk of conflict, risk of emotional drain. The city becomes less social, not because people want isolation, but because chaos makes connection costly. And here's the paradox. New York is still loud, crowded, and busy, yet it feels strangely empty of shared experience. Everyone is moving, but rarely together. Everyone is present, but rarely engaged. The energy that once felt electric now feels scattered, disconnected, burned off by constant friction before it can coalesce into anything joyful. This is how a city loses its sense of play, not through catastrophe, but through accumulation. One small inconvenience, after another, layered until the city feels heavy. People don't stop having fun because they forgot how. They stop because the environment makes fun feel irresponsible, risky, or simply not worth the effort. And once chaos becomes normal, the most radical act isn't complaining. It's leaving. Choosing places where disorder isn't the background noise of everyday life, where normal doesn't mean exhausting. New York is still one of the richest cities on the planet, yet for the people who actually live here, it increasingly fails at the most basic function of a city, making daily life workable. Wealth is everywhere, but usability is scarce. The contradiction is impossible to ignore once you start paying attention. Luxury towers rise while public services strain. Record profits are announced while ordinary routines collapse. This isn't poverty in the traditional sense. It's dysfunction inside abundance. The city has money, but it's unevenly deployed. Enormous capital flows into real estate speculation, branding, and elite experiences, while the systems that support everyday life quietly deteriorate. The result is a city optimized for extraction, not habitation. Great for transactions, terrible for living. For residents, this creates a constant sense of imbalance. You see wealth everywhere, yet feel deprived of time, calm, and stability. You pass multi-million-dollar apartments while waiting for a delayed train. You walk past high-end boutiques while navigating broken sidewalks. The message is subtle but persistent. The city is working, just not for you. This gap reshapes priorities. When the environment stops supporting normal life, people shrink their world. They stay closer to home. They go out less. They simplify. Not because they want less, but because the cost of participation is too high. Fun becomes selective, rare, carefully rationed. The city may be rich, but residents feel resource poor. What makes this especially corrosive is how normalized it's become. Complaints are met with resignation. That's New York. That's the price you pay, as if dysfunction is proof of importance, as if suffering validates status. This narrative traps people in a cycle where endurance is mistaken for achievement. Meanwhile, the city continues to market itself globally as vibrant, exciting, and limitless. Visitors arrive expecting energy and possibility, Many leave sensing tension instead. Locals notice the gap immediately. The city performs well on paper, but poorly in practice. And the longer that gap persists, the more people start asking a dangerous question. If all this wealth can't make life feel livable, what's it actually for? This is where the breaking point forms, not in anger, but in clarity. People realize they are giving more than they receive. More time, more money, more emotional bandwidth. And when that realization settles in, loyalty fades. You don't storm out of a city like this. You disengage. Then you look elsewhere. Because a city that no longer works for its residents eventually stops being fun for anyone. And once that realization spreads, the shift isn't theoretical. It becomes visible in where people choose to go next. What finally pushes people away from New York isn't always money or logistics. It's what the city does to the inside of your head over time. The psychological weight accumulates quietly, without clear milestones. You don't wake up one day feeling broken. You wake up feeling numb, detached, less curious, less playful. That's the real cost few talk about. Living in a high-pressure urban environment keeps the nervous system permanently activated. Noise, crowds, urgency, unpredictability. Your body never fully relaxes. Even on days off, your mind stays alert, scanning, bracing. That constant state of low-grade stress erodes emotional reserves. You become more irritable, more impatient, more withdrawn, not because you changed, but because the environment demands it. This is why people in New York often feel tired even when nothing is technically wrong. They're not lazy, they're overstimulated. The city floods the brain with input while starving it of recovery. Silence is rare, space is rare, stillness feels unnatural. And when the mind never gets to reset, joy loses its intensity. Laughter becomes shorter, excitement fades faster, fun feels muted, social life suffers next. When everyone is overwhelmed, emotional availability disappears, conversations stay shallow, plans fall through. People cancel not because they don't care, but because they don't have the capacity. Over time, this creates isolation in one of the most densely populated places on Earth. You're surrounded by people, yet deeply alone. What's dangerous about this psychological erosion is how normalized it feels. Burnout is worn like a badge. Anxiety is joked about. Exhaustion becomes personality. If you struggle, it's framed as personal weakness rather than environmental pressure. The city gaslights its residents into believing the problem is them. Eventually, people notice a pattern. They feel lighter when they leave, calmer, more open, more themselves. Not on vacation in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, telling way. Their shoulders drop, their thoughts slow, their laughter lasts longer. That contrast is hard to ignore once you feel it. This is the moment when leaving stops being about ambition or opportunity and starts being about mental survival. People don't chase a better life. They retreat from an environment that no longer allows one. And when enough people reach that realization, the city's energy changes. It becomes sharper, more transactional, less forgiving. Because a city that constantly drains emotional bandwidth cannot sustain joy. It can only sustain motion. And motion without joy is not fun. It's obligation. There's a strange silence surrounding New York right now. Not the absence of noise, the city is still loud, but a refusal to name what's happening. People sense the shift. They feel it in their bodies, their routines, their relationships. Yet few are willing to say it clearly. The dream that once justified everything no longer works the way it used to. This silence isn't accidental. New York's identity depends on belief. Belief that the struggle pays off. Belief that the sacrifice is temporary. Belief that endurance equals success. Admitting that the payoff is gone would collapse the entire narrative. So the city keeps performing confidence even as enthusiasm drains away. Institutions play their role. Media outlets highlight growth, innovation, record revenues. Social feeds showcase rooftop parties and curated moments that suggest nothing has changed. But lived reality tells a different story. Fewer people linger. Fewer people stay out late. Fewer people build long-term plans here. The energy feels thinner, more forced, like a party that technically continues after everyone stopped having fun. On an individual level, denial becomes a coping mechanism. Admitting the dream is broken would mean confronting sunk costs, years of rent, years of stress, years of missed time. It's easier to say you're just tired or that this phase will pass than to acknowledge the environment itself has changed. So people adapt their expectations downward and call it maturity. This collective denial has consequences. It delays change. It keeps policies reactive instead of reflective. It turns legitimate criticism into personal failure narratives. If you're not thriving, the logic goes, you're doing it wrong. That mindset isolates people who are already stretched thin. Meanwhile, those who leave rarely announce it dramatically. They don't frame it as escape or protest. They say things like, it just makes more sense, or we wanted something calmer. The exodus happens quietly, without confrontation, which makes it easy to dismiss, until the patterns become impossible to ignore. The most revealing sign isn't population data or headlines. It's conversation. People talk less about what they're building here and more about where they might go next. The future tense shifts outward. That's when a city loses its gravitational pull. New York doesn't need to be declared dead to be fundamentally changed. It only needs enough people to stop believing that the dream justifies the cost. And once that belief erodes, even slowly, the city's identity starts to unravel. New York is no longer just a city. It's a preview, a live experiment showing what happens when urban success is measured by revenue, branding, and prestige instead of human experience. What's unfolding here isn't unique. It's simply happening earlier, faster, and more visibly than in most places. That's why what's happening in New York matters far beyond its borders. For decades, global cities followed the same blueprint. Concentrate wealth, attract talent, market intensity as opportunity, normalize sacrifice as ambition. It worked until it didn't. New York perfected this model so completely that its flaws are now impossible to hide. When fun disappears, when living feels like a test instead of a life, the model breaks down. What we're seeing now is the limit of urban density without emotional infrastructure. Cities can scale buildings, transit systems, and digital services, but they struggle to scale ease, trust, and joy. When those elements erode, cities become impressive but inhospitable. People stay because they have to, not because they want to. And once choice enters the equation, loyalty evaporates. This is why the migration patterns matter. People aren't just leaving New York for cheaper rent. They're choosing cities that feel lighter. Places where fun still happens without planning, where daily life doesn't demand constant vigilance, where infrastructure works quietly in the background instead of dominating attention. These places don't need to advertise themselves as exciting. They feel livable. The warning here is subtle but serious. Cities that ignore this shift will keep losing residents who value quality of life over status. They will double down on spectacle, tourism, and high-end consumption to compensate. That strategy might work temporarily, but it hollows out the social core. A city full of visitors but empty of rooted life eventually becomes fragile. New York shows us what happens when the gap between image and experience grows too wide, when fun becomes performative, when living becomes conditional, when denial replaces reflection. The city doesn't collapse dramatically. It simply stops inspiring attachment, and once attachment fades, people don't fight to stay. They quietly go elsewhere, not to rebel, but to breathe, not to make a statement, but to feel normal again. The future of big cities will belong to places that understand this lesson early, that prioritize human rhythms over constant stimulation, that design for ease, not endurance, that remember cities exist to support life, not extract from it. New York didn't fail because it lacked ambition. It failed because it forgot why people came in the first place. If you stayed with this video until the end, it means something here resonated. Not as entertainment, but as recognition. What you've just heard isn't about nostalgia or negativity. It's about clarity. And clarity only matters when people are willing to engage with it. If you felt this shift in New York or in any major city, leave a comment saying, "The city got heavier." That simple phrase helps surface a reality many people feel but rarely say out loud. Your comment isn't just engagement, it's evidence. If this breakdown helped you understand why urban life feels different now, hit the like button. It tells the platform that this conversation deserves space. And if you want more deep, honest analysis about cities, systems, and the human cost behind modern urban life, subscribe to the channel. These stories don't show up in headlines, but they shape how people live every day. And before you go, watch the next video appearing on your screen. It continues this thread by showing where people are actually going now and why those places feel lighter, calmer, and more human.